Hello, everyone. Welcome to Live from New Amsterdam. My name is Russell Shorto. This is the first in a monthly series of 30-minute lunchtime conversations on the subject of New Amsterdam and New Netherland, the Dutch settlement that predated New York City. And it's brought to you by the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York, and the New York Historical Society on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. These are, as I say, 30 minutes, so the time goes by very quickly. And I want to jump right in and bring on our first guest, Kamau Ware. Kamau, are you there?
I'm here. Hello.
There he is. By way of introduction, Kamau is an award-winning visual artist and storyteller. He's based in New York. He creates narratives about the African diaspora's history through photography, film, exhibitions, and events. In 2010, he created the Black Gotham Experience, which uses art and walks through the streets of New York to illustrate the impact of the African diaspora in New York City. So welcome, Kamau. Thanks for being the first guest.
It's a definite honor. As you know, I've been a big fan of you. This microphone is kind of, okay. I guess we got to keep an eye on that. I'll just restate that. I was just stating that I'm a big fan of your work and always have appreciated the island at the center of the world as an important jumping off point to get different points of view of the environment that people of African descent were arriving in this territory, known as Lenape-Hoken, that was renamed New Netherlands. So it's great to be in conversation with you and be your first guest.
So I want to get into that history, but first I want to just ask you a little bit about how, can you explain what ways you use art to tell this story?
Yeah, well, the main element of art and creativity is imagination, being able to see something, experience things that might not already exist, to create some kind of unique expression, which could be anything from how you see things differently by taking a walk, which also in many respects is its own art form, as well as creating things that might not exist in the archive that we know took place. Like there's a number of characters that are very colorful that you mentioned in Island at the Center of the World, but by doing that research, you may have come across a photograph or a large painting of some of these characters. And so utilizing art, we're just having a way of illustrating what's there, but not always visible or not always easy to experience if you're not like a historian going into. Yeah, so part of what I thought initially was a deficit because we did not have a lot of images of people of the African diaspora in the 1600s, 1500s, 1700s. What I found is by asking people to use their imagination and be creative and consider through empathy what these lived experiences might be like, what they may have seen, it actually has been a major blessing and a benefit for storytelling because there's been just great research on the power of people to tap into their own memory that might not be always just, their lived experience, but like just deep memory encoded in their body, as well as just, stories about walking being a very powerful creative means to see things in new perspectives. And so by asking people to empathize and to walk around and see things different, I'm getting far more traction than if I just showed them a picture, because then they would kind of stop and say, oh yeah, we're done, versus I have to actively engage.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that is the classic problem with trying to write history or do history with marginalized groups, because what you find, I mean, we're working on putting together an exhibit now. And, of course, the material that's available is from the elite. You got their collections of silver and all those kinds of things. But, for other people, there's not even a picture of them.
Yeah, and even people who might have, like let's take Thomas Jefferson, for example. Plenty of books written about him. He kept a diary. We have his own context for his own life by his own hand. But even the person who has a celebrated archive that passes through centuries, even what you leave behind doesn't quite give you all that a person is and can be. And so once you activate that muscle of understanding that the human being can't be deduced into even an exhibition or a flat file, you begin to appreciate how much the process of having the humility of asking yourself, what's this person's life like? How can I begin to try to inhabit or consider their mind state and their emotional framework to look at history not as something that is just written and done, but as an ongoing conversation. And that's been just a very powerful thing to watch people engage with over the past 10, 12 years.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned walks and a walking tour as an art form. And I've been with you in the streets of New York, and you do turn it into an art form. So take us, kind of virtually into the streets of New Amsterdam. What would it look and feel like, particularly to an African resident, whether enslaved or free?
Yeah, well, part of approaching New Amsterdam or New Netherlands, and just as a little level setting, New Amsterdam was more or less Wall Street down, and New Netherlands parts of New Jersey, Delaware, and New York. And just another cheat code, I like to look at the time period of Netherlands, New Amsterdam as a full basketball game with 4 quarters. It was a 40-year history, and in many respects, things changed during halftime. And so for those who are like listening in, and you might hear me say New Netherlands versus New Amsterdam, is because there were people that were of African descent that might have lived in New Netherlands, but not New Amsterdam, based upon it being like the capital versus the state. Just a little nerd note for everybody listening. Well, one of the things I like to think about when I consider people of African descent navigating through the territory of New Netherlands, I think it's important to just keep in mind that we often project backwards what certain dynamics would have been like. And I've come across a number of people on our walks who find it very unique and phenomenal that there were Black people that were petitioning successfully land ownership and getting 18 acres of land, 12 acres of land, 4 acres of land. But the thing that I like to just tease out is that what we often just look at as slavery, which is not a singular thing, but changes a lot over different territories and times, is a lot of it dependent upon the religion that people had that were doing the enslavement. And for these Calvinists from the Netherlands who were looking to be quite different than Catholics, it wasn't like a large state operation that was oppressing people psychologically to say you're not a human being. And so I think that Black people that were in the Netherlands had a degree of personhood that even through enslavement wasn't challenged. And that's one of the first things I want people just to begin to, once again, think about empathetically, physically, as you move through the street, is that your humanity wasn't in question in 1630, 1660, like it would have been even like in 1810, when people were sending quote unquote slave catchers to New York to bring folks back down south, because our Constitution more or less created a sanctioned level of dehumanization. And so progress is not a straight line. And so when you go back to the 1600s, you might find yourself thinking, oh yeah, the further I go back, the worse it's going to be. And it's like, actually, everything is contextual.
Okay, so I think that's a really good point to make, because Americans, I think, tend to think slavery was slavery, but it changed in different circumstances, different places and times. So in New Netherlands, you had a greater, I guess you said personhood, a fuller sense of personhood than you might have 50 or 100 years later. But what would it have been? How would you characterize what slavery was in that time?
Yeah, well, I think that the company slave dynamic is worth noting, which is something that the Dutch were looking at doing as an act of capitalism to establish this port city, not quite a township yet. It was, as you know, that was a transition that happened with different director generals as time moved on. And so for some time, Black people were looked at as, you are enslaved to the company. And because you're enslaved to the company, the boss, the director general, is more or less kind of in charge of everybody's situation. And Black people were like at the bottom of society, but you also didn't have a large state apparatus. There wasn't like a large police force, a large punitive force, a large incarceration force. And so even though you had those kind of statistics or from the town, people did still get a chance to have a large degree of mobility. There were Black people that came from places that had already experienced the first colony on the continent, which is Angola. Some of the names of the people carry that story with them, names like Manuel or Domingo, which are Iberian names. People coming from parts of like the Congo and Angola, who back in the early 1500s already were, converting to Catholicism. And so a lot of the people who are of African descent in New Netherlands would have spoken like 2 or 3 languages and been quite familiar with Catholicism and getting more familiar with Calvinism as the years went on. And so they were far more worldly than we would often depict a person who we would imagine being a quote unquote slave. So yeah, well, they're enslaved. They probably can't read or write. They probably don't know where they came from. They might have been kidnapped as kids, but instead you have adults who are like lived a life and then end up pirated and then brought to New Netherlands. So I think that from the interior perspective, even though we can talk about where buildings were, where roads were, it's important to understand that the interior life of these people of African descent moving through the Netherlands was far more expansive than one who was self-limiting, where they saw themselves as limiting or narrow. But what you see is an ongoing act of negotiating a way to extend their rights and form unions and petition collectively and adopt each other's children. And numerically, we're talking about like, under 100 people, we're talking about, dozens of people working together in a space that also isn't like quite 1,000 people yet either. And so I think those are important notes to consider. But I do think that Bowery is a fun place to think about how, it was a first postal road, but also you have Black families living on both sides of Bowery that takes you up toward what is now Manuel Plaza. So I think that the community aspect of Black people's existence is a good thing to keep in mind when thinking about how do you maneuver, who has your back.
Yeah,
how do people look at you?
That's really well put. You're talking about these are people who would have come. I mean, of course, they came unwillingly, but one thing they had, which maybe later generations would not have, is they already had a full interior life, and they had a sense of where they were from and what their culture was. And by and large, I think people think about American slavery as having the people having come from West Africa. This was a different migration, if you can use the word migration. These were people from Central Africa, and they, as you said, they probably had been raised with Catholicism. So they're kind of Europeanized in a way. So they weren't, this wasn't hitting them in quite the same way you might imagine.
Yeah, but in the same way that they might have had some understanding of European culture, there were Christians in Africa before there were Christians in Europe. There were Christians in Ethiopia before, you had like Lutherans or Calvinists.
Yeah.
And so the way that people in Angola and Congo became Catholic is because people are trying to get to India as a way to extend a war against, Muslims. And this is also just context for slavery from the standpoint of it being a far more religious belligerence than skin color belligerence. You might have had people who would be a range of skin colors that might be Muslim, or a range of skin colors that might be Catholic, but just so happens that most people that were Muslim happen to be more brown or darker skinned than people that were Catholic who tended to be more European skin color, which would have been, I guess people can consider white. And so these are people who, yes, have European ways or like context, but also the way Catholicism was presented to the king of then the Congo in like the late 1400s, early 1500s. This idea of like a person being God or being divine fits into the cosmology of people from the Congo, and so it wasn't that different. And so in many respects, whether it be Yoruba or Santeria, certain ideas of like deities or man inhabiting divinity wasn't that different than a lot of different indigenous religious systems of people who were African. But I do think that when you just to kind of give like a little bit of like geography, I think that the way Black people existed in society in like the 1620s and 30s, people were more or less like closer together. It wasn't like, hey, like this is where Black people are versus here's where Dutch people are. Like people are more or less like in the same kind of quarters. There were forms of punishment that existed where people would have to work with the Negroes, so to speak, or the company slaves. But like by and large, as this operation is being built up, there wasn't a heavy state hand that separated people, and it was a small amount of people at that. And so folks were more or less, you know, intermixed in many respects.
Yeah, and this is way before slave codes. That's sort of
Mhm.
system that governs aspects of their life. So to get back to that question, if you're an African resident of a colony, whether slave or free, when you're walking through the streets of New Amsterdam, it's not the same way probably that somebody 50 years later would experience it.
Or even 41, 43. You know, we think about Solomon Northup was captured in DC, came from Saratoga. He was born free in New York State, but you know, he's captured and he's sold into slavery at the age of like 30, 32, 33 years old. And so this is like before the Civil War, but well after the Constitution has been written. And so it's a little bit ironic when you think about people like Manuel Garrett DeRoos, who is accused of killing somebody and draws a short straw and has to go through this capital punishment case that goes wrong. You jump forward like 200 years and Black people are being kidnapped. You know, he's accused of murder, but then he's given a chance to have redemption and become a landowner and live out his days in New Netherland. But you jump forward 200 years and Black people who are free and have a family are being kidnapped and can't even go to federal court and fight for their rights because our, you know, federal court system decided that Black people aren't human beings. And so I think that, you know, once again, it's an invitation to have a conversation more than just like, we got it all figured out, the book's done. You know, these texts that are generated by, you know, scholars like yourself create ways for us to not just read it on the page, but to begin to step into space and ask ourselves, what's it like to go from that transition? Because we have like 13 different walks that we've created. And we notice that as we literally walk toward the future, sometimes things get worse, sometimes things get better, but it's always a mixed bag.
Excellent point. I just want to mention that we're going to try to, even though the time is short, we're going to try to get a couple of questions in here from those who are tuning in. So if you want to put questions in the chat, we'll get to a couple of them. What you were just talking about there is relates to the legal system that the Africans were and everybody else was living under. And you mentioned before petitioning for freedom and so on. Talk a little bit about that and about how people maneuvered, for example, within Africans within the church, the Dutch Reformed Church.
Yeah, I mean, I want to shout out Christopher Moore, who passed away last year and was an amazing historian. You probably worked with him or met him before. And he traced his lineage back to some of these initial people of African descent that were establishing the land of the Blacks, which began around 1643. And it did not end in 1664, just kind of began to take a different shape. It was like 20 different land grants that were earned over time through this process of petitioning, but the bulk of them were done before 1650 as far as scale and size. But you have people who were married in churches who have these records of marriage that then allow more insight into who's marrying whom and who the children are. And one of the things that we're looking at working on is a map that shows you where different Black lands were, but also go beyond just stating perhaps like Manuel Trumpeter was the owner of the land, but look at like, well, who was he married to? Did he pass on? And he did. And then, you know, he had like a stepdaughter who later on was advocated for by Domingo, who married his wife that was his widow. So you see all these different ways that people are finding community as an ongoing practice, but it's necessary because if you're like about, you know, 20, 30, 60 Black folk, and you're like a minority and there's wars going on between like the Dutch and the indigenous Americans here, other people being your neighbor and looking out for you is a big part of like how you're going to find some kind of safety and some kind of security, especially when, you know, maybe the majority of your time in New Netherlands was as a company slave, and maybe you might have 1 or 2 years into this quote unquote have freedom where you have land, you got to pay taxes on it, and you got to buy your children's freedom. That still was like a bit of a precarious sentiment to be in when you're a person who's looking out for your family. And I think that the idea of family also is interesting to see how people created these notions of kinship that are very African. Sometimes I talk to people about how, you know, Domingo married Antonia and was petitioning for her freedom around 1663, and the idea that people were also adopting children and saying, yeah, this is our child, we want to leave our land with that person. That's also very African. It's not to say, oh yeah, there's like nobody here but us, so I'm going to adopt you. It's like, you know, aunties and uncles reign supreme in a lot of African cultures across the continent. And so this notion that there's people of African descent that are here from a common country that speak a common language, maybe your parents aren't here, you're by yourself, or maybe your husband died, someone else is going to marry you and make sure that the household is together. And that's one of the things I find often inspiring, not just from the standpoint of how Black people negotiated with Europeans who were in power, but just how you see Black people looking toward each other to generate power and to generate a way of negotiating collectively to look out for the community. That I think is an important aspect of how we go from slavery to freedom. You know, those very important notes, which might not be a law, but it's like, hey, you saw these Black folks work together. You know what I'm saying? I think that's an important part of looking at how we always have made progress of people of African descent on this side of the ocean is community.
Sure. And I just want to say again, if anybody wants to has a question they want to type into the chat, please do. So you're talking, and I think it's a really good point that you're talking about agency, that these people had greater agency than slaves might have a generation or two later. But I don't want to give the misleading impression that, you know, they were walking around, you know, just able to do whatever they want. How, and you also referenced the fact that there are times in the Dutch record that point to if a white person was really being punished, they were made to work alongside the Blacks.
Mm-hmm.
So that indicates this is the bottom rung of society. So what did they, you know, how were they constrained?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, and this is part of the way I look at how religion continues to play an ongoing role from the transfer of power from the Dutch time period to the British time period to the time period we're in right now, the United States, is going back to like personhood. And I think that one thing that you see is that even though we understand these are people who are probably Catholic when they're first being captured at sea or being brought to the Netherlands, that one of their means of mobility is to become baptized, their children, and to also adopt Calvinism. And then you know, some of the dominies, as you know, begin to say things like, hey, they're just becoming Christian like us because they want to free their kids. You know, we you know, there's lots of baptisms and lots of conversions happening in the 1620s and 30s. And then it's like, wait a minute, we got to like slow down on this because they're just trying to get free. And it's like, what's wrong with that kind of religion?
With that? Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that kind of gospel, last time I checked. And so part of what you have is, I feel this ongoing psychological weathering of having to prove your humanity, even when it's not a slave code or a state law or a Supreme Court decision or a constitution. I think that has an effect on people's mental state. And I think that before I even look at where Black people may have worked in the conditions of those labor, I think about the kind of things that create wounds that are not on the skin. You know, this constant energetic sense of like, I have to, you know, go to church and get baptized and baptize my children. And maybe they'll say, oh, well, we're the same religion, we go to the same church. Perhaps it doesn't quite make as much sense to enslave you or have you be enslaved forever? And one of the arguments that Amsterdam Project made as a lawyer who worked for the Rensselaers, who then broke away from him, who was one of the board of directors for the West Indian Dutch Company, people like Amsterdam Project is advocating for Black people to have more rights, and in part because of their Christian status. Hey, like they're also our Christian brothers and sisters. Why are we doing this to them? And so when I think about Black people's suffering during this time period, I think a lot of times we don't look at those wounds that don't show up on skin, because those are very powerful, morbid things to see, is how Black bodies were treated. But sometimes there's the way that the body is treated when you empathize and imagine the psychological trauma of having to continually find ways to prove that you are indeed a soul or a living, breathing manifestation of God, just like the next person. And I think that that's something that that's part of what I imagine is one of the most difficult parts about being an African person in New Amsterdam and the Netherlands, is regardless to what you gain, it's the ongoing transaction of how do I prove I deserve the same as somebody else.
We only have a few minutes left. I'm going to summarize a few of these questions and you take whatever you want. One person is asking about Dutch Sephardic Jews and their relationship to the slave trade. Someone else is recommending books or articles on the topic. I can recommend Andrea Mosterman's book, Spaces of Enslavement, which was out last year. Is there any evidence of interracial marriage? Take whatever you want there.
Yeah, well, I think the most fascinating one, and I've talked to a friend of mine, I brought it up a few times, but if you look at why you even have Portuguese people in Angola and the Congo, is in part because both the Portuguese and the Spanish, by 1492, have created a Catholic state. And the first people they kick out are people who are Islamic, who had about 800-year rule of Iberia. And just to kind of put it mathematically, that today, January 25th, 2023, as of this date, Iberia has still been Islamic longer than it's been Catholic, going back to 1492. So it's a very long time that this peninsula was under Islamic rule. And so we might know about the Spanish Inquisition, but it's like before they were looking for people, before they kicked the Jews out of Iberia, they also kicked out the Muslims first. And so part of what you have is that after it was unstudied, is that if you look at the actual trajectory of the transatlantic slave trade, beginning with the Iberians, enslaving Black people primarily as an outcome of like a crusade mentality, you also have neatly fit with that also the story of Sephardic Judaism, because people that were kicked out of the Spain and Portugal that were Jewish happens right after the Muslims are kicked out. And right after that takes place, you begin to see Black bodies being captured, kidnapped, and sold under the guise of, well, the Pope says it's okay. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that there's a lot of parallels there that allows you to look at Sephardic Judaism specifically and look at the transatlantic slave trade and have an ongoing timeline with two layers to see how complex this world is going to be. And one thing I found from spending some time in Amsterdam and talking to people like Mark Ponce, who is a historian at the Municipal Archives in Amsterdam, is where he talks about how people that were Jewish in Spain or Portugal that were kicked out of the peninsula came to Amsterdam, and some of them were in fact also enslavers too. But in Amsterdam, it wasn't legal to own slaves, and so some of them began to like break away and create their own community. At the same time, Black people were forming communities in New Amsterdam. And so you have like 1630s and 40s, Black people on both sides of the Atlantic are exploring ways how to navigate this new, more belligerent environment where being Black somehow means being a slave. And so, yeah, there's all kind of connections there. Like, you know, we got like a minute, we can't get into all of it, but I do feel like that timeline is a useful way for us to think about some of the similarities and connections between different people on different sides of the dynamic.
Yeah, that's these are not simple questions that you can answer succinctly in a minute or two. The interracial marriage, you want to talk about that for 30 seconds?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the one that I bring up that often is fairly complex, like 1643. There's a conflict going on, and you have Von de Vries, who's coming to New Netherland as a captain of soldiers, and he's leaving from Brazil with an African woman he purchased, who he marries in church, known as Swartine. And I just kind of share that as a thing to look at from multiple angles. I don't say that he was necessarily a slave trader and a rapist, and she had no options or no choices, but he did purchase this African woman in Brazil, bring her to New Amsterdam, and then marry her. I do think that the fact that you have Von der Vries also as someone who advocated for Black people's freedoms as well, and when like people were like angry at him harboring Black people in his home and not giving them up when they're supposed to be handed over, and the fact that he was like a godfather, I believe, to Paulo de Angola's son. You have all these interesting characters who you can't like just like see in one angle, and I think that that's how all people are. I mean, if you take, you know, me right now, January, what is it, 26? I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. I'm still changing. I was a different kind of person as a kid. And I think that the flattening of people is, and the flattening of dynamics is just doesn't serve our curiosities or our souls. And I just encourage people to understand the complexity that people and things are and step into it more empathetically and creatively than thinking that you get it all figured out because you read something. That's just a starting point or a middle point.
Great point to end on for any discussion of history. Thank you, Kamau Ware, for being our first guest. The next iteration of this will be February 23rd at noon. And our guest will be Dwayne Blue Spruce, who is a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian. And we will talk about their terrific new exhibit, Native New York, and much else. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Russell.
Thanks, Kamau.